By 1950, the 3006 Springfield cartridge was on its way out. The Army's post-war planners had already moved on. Standardization arguments were underway, newer calibers were in development, and the procurement machinery was pointed at a different future. The men running the logistics chain in Washington had a plan, and the 3006 was not in it. Then the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, and the plan died on contact with reality. What followed was not a stopgap. What actually happened when American soldiers took their grandfather's cartridge into the mountains of Korea changed how Soviet military planners thought about rifle lethality, not for months, but for decades. The fear that the 3006 generated in that theater was documented, analyzed, and quietly set aside inside the Army's own after-action system. The reason it was set aside is the part nobody put in the pamphlets. On November 27, 1950, at the Chosin Reservoir, Marine and Army units equipped with M1 Garands, chambered in 3006, held off Chinese People's Volunteer Army forces, attacking in human wave formations across open, frozen ground. The Chinese commanders filed reports afterward. Soviet advisors read those reports. What they concluded about that cartridge did not match anything the American procurement system was prepared to hear. The 3006 Springfield was born from failure. Not American failure, German success. At the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898, American forces were outgunned by Spanish soldiers carrying German-made Mauser rifles chambered in 7 by 57 millimeters. The regulars had the Krag Jorgensen, a bolt action that used smokeless powder but loaded one round at a time and couldn't handle higher chamber pressures. Volunteer units carried single-shot 45-70 trapdoor Springfields that announced their position with a cloud of black powder smoke on every shot. Against the Mauser's stripper clip loading and flat-shooting Spitzer bullet, neither weapon was adequate. The after-action analysis was blunt. The United States Army had gone to war with rifles that belonged to the previous century. The Army moved fast by its own standards. By 1903, it had adopted the Springfield M1903, chambered initially in 3003. 2 years later, following German adoption of the S. Patrone Spitzer bullet, American engineers revised the cartridge again. The result, standardized in 1906, was the 3006 Springfield. 150 grains at approximately 2,700 feet per second. At the ranges where infantry actually fought, it hit harder and shot flatter than anything the Army had previously fielded. The cartridge served in the Meuse-Argonne. It served in the Pacific and on the beaches of Normandy. By 1945, it had been fired from M1903 bolt-action rifles, Browning automatic rifles, M1919 medium machine guns, and from the M1 Garand, the first semi-automatic rifle widely adopted as standard issue by a major power. General George Patton called the Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. The problem arrived with the armistice. A cartridge optimized for European distances now had to justify itself against a procurement culture pivoting toward lighter, faster, intermediate calibers. The Soviets had fielded the 7.62 by 39 mm in the AK-47. NATO was already arguing standardization. The 3006 was a full-power round in a world starting to question whether full power was still worth the wait. When Korea began, M1 Garands were available in large numbers, and the 3006 supply chain, though aging, was functional. The question nobody at the Pentagon had answered was whether any of that would matter when the shooting started. And they were about to find out. The conventional reading of the Korean War's early months treats the Task Force Smith disaster of July 5, 1950, as a failure of numbers and support. Too few men, no artillery worth mentioning, a bureaucracy that had gutted the Army's readiness during the post-war drawdown. That reading is correct as far as it goes. What it omits is the specific performance data that came out of the first engagements. Task Force Smith. 540 men drawn from the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division, was under strength, undertrained, and positioned without adequate anti-tank weapons against North Korean T-34-85 tanks. Their bazookas were the M9A1 model, firing a 2.36-inch rocket that had been designed before the T-34's improved armor was fully understood. Second Lieutenant Ollie Connor fired 22 rockets from 15 yards at the tank's rear armor where the steel was thinnest. Every round failed. The tank kept moving. But the M1 rifles performed. Against the North Korean infantry following those tanks, the Garands gave American soldiers a rate of fire that the NKPA commanders had not planned for. The 30-06 round, at 200 to 600 yards across Korean farm terrain, was stopping men reliably. The problem at Task Force Smith was not the rifle. There were not enough men carrying it, the position was untenable, and when the artillery ammunition ran out, there was nothing left to anchor the line. The Army's initial after-action reviews noted the rifle's effectiveness without dwelling on it. The institutional focus was on the anti-armor gap. Performance against personnel was treated as expected, almost unremarkable, which meant it received almost no analytical attention at the moment when that attention would have been most useful. That omission had consequences. By late 1950, Chinese forces had entered the war and the combat geometry had shifted. At Unsan in early November 1950, the 8th Cavalry Regiment was struck and partially overrun by Chinese 39th Army units. What emerged from those engagements was something the after-action system was not built to process. 30-06 cartridges fired from M1 Garands and M1919 machine guns in mass defensive positions were generating casualty rates in attacking formations that exceeded what the planning system had predicted for that range and terrain. The Chinese were documenting it. American intelligence was not yet reading those documents carefully enough. The Army knew by 1951 that it needed a new rifle. That much was not in dispute. What remained unsettled was what cartridge that rifle would fire. And the argument consumed 5 years of inter-service politics, NATO negotiating sessions, and congressional hearings that produced mountains of paper and not much clarity. The British wanted their .280 intermediate cartridge, lower recoil, lighter weight, at the cost of some long-range performance. The Americans were not interested. The Army Ordnance Corps had invested heavily in the T-65 cartridge, what would eventually become the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, and was not prepared to abandon a full-power approach for an intermediate solution that no American general had yet endorsed. What the institutional logic could not process was the testimony coming out of Korea. Infantry officers who had fought in both theaters, the Pacific and Korea, were noting in their field reports that Korea's engagements demanded high-volume fire at close to medium range, not the precision long-range shooting that American doctrine had been built around. The terrain, ridgelines, reverse slopes, narrow valleys, compressed the distances. The Chinese use of human wave tactics meant a soldier's first concern was rate of fire, not 800-yard accuracy. The M1 Garand in this environment was both the right answer and the wrong one simultaneously. It was reliable, accurate, and its 30-06 round hit hard enough to stop a man cleanly, even through the quilted winter uniforms that Chinese troops were wearing. Uniforms that Korean War veterans consistently reported required more hits to defeat than the lighter clothing worn by NKPA infantry earlier in the campaign. The Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip was a real limitation in sustained firefights, and its weight, 9.5 pounds unloaded, was a problem in the mountains. But the round itself was not the problem. The men on the line understood this. The procurement system wasn't listening. It was listening to the NATO standardization arguments, the ordnance development timelines, and the congressional budget process. The soldier who had carried his Garand up a frozen ridgeline at 3 a.m. and stopped a Chinese assault at 80 yards was not in any of those rooms. The story the Army set aside was not about failure. It was about a performance so extreme that acknowledging it fully would have complicated everything the system was trying to do. At the Chosin Reservoir in late November and early December 1950, the 1st Marine Division and elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division were surrounded by approximately 120,000 troops from 10 divisions of the Chinese 9th Army Group. The temperature dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons failed. Lubricants froze. Vehicles would not start. The M1 Garand did not stop working. Marines and soldiers who survived the breakout reported that the Garand functioned when the M1 carbine, chambered in the much lighter .30 carbine round, lost stopping power in the extreme cold, and when BAR teams were the only crew-served weapons still reliably cycling. The .30-06 round's mass and velocity left it with more residual energy at those temperatures than the lighter cartridges could deliver under normal conditions. The Chinese 9th Army Group suffered an estimated 40,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and frostbite cases severe enough to render soldiers combat ineffective during the Chosin engagement. Soviet advisors were embedded with Chinese forces throughout the Korean campaign, filing detailed after-action reports on American weapons and tactics. U.S. intelligence assessments from the period indicate those reports included observations on small arms effectiveness. What the Soviets appear to have concluded about American rifle fire at the ranges where Chinese assault formations were being broken up, typically 150 to 400 yards, was that the .30-06 projectile was producing wound profiles severe enough to remove soldiers from the fight with a frequency that lighter intermediate cartridges did not replicate. That conclusion, if it reached Soviet planners in the form American intelligence suggested, would have validated full-power cartridge advocates inside the Red Army, who had been arguing against the 7.62 by 39mm intermediate faction since the late 1940s. The Americans, meanwhile, were deciding to abandon the .30-06 for the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, and eventually the 5.56 by 45mm, an intermediate cartridge that did precisely what Soviet intermediate round theorists had championed. The Army moved toward the caliber philosophy its adversary had reportedly concluded was inferior. It did not do so because the .30-06 had failed. It did so because the system had a different argument to win, and the men who had carried that cartridge through the worst cold of the 20th century were never asked. That argument had consequences that did not resolve themselves quietly. The 5.56 by 45mm cartridge, adopted with the M16 in the 1960s, generated its own sustained debate about terminal effectiveness, a debate that ran through Vietnam, through Mogadishu, and deep into Afghanistan. In 2009, Major Thomas Earhart published a widely cited paper at the Army's Command and General Staff College, arguing the 5.56 was fundamentally inadequate for Afghan terrain, where insurgents with Soviet-era SVD sniper rifles and PKM machine guns routinely initiated contact beyond 400 meters. Special operations units had already reached the same conclusion. They were carrying 77-grain Mark II 62 rounds, and increasingly, 7.62mm designated marksman rifles alongside their M4s, because the standard cartridge could not reliably reach targets at the ranges where the fight was happening. By the mid-2000s, some conventional infantry elements were deploying with the Mark 17 SCAR-H and the HK-417, both chambered in 7.62 by 51mm NATO, the direct descendant of the T-65 cartridge that had replaced the .30-06 in the first place. The Army's next-generation squad weapon program, which selected the SIG Spear chambered in 6.8 by 51mm common cartridge in 2022, was explicitly designed to restore the long-range terminal performance that the 5.56 had sacrificed. The wheel had turned. 70 years after Chosin, the Army was arguing for a full-power cartridge in the infantryman's hands, for the same reasons the men at the reservoir had already proved and nobody had acted on. There is a pattern in American military procurement that repeats across every major conflict since 1900. The soldier who survives contact with the enemy knows something the system does not. The system finds a reason to discard what he knows, arrives at a different answer, and then spends the next war relearning the lesson he already paid for. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge was declared obsolete before it had finished teaching its lessons. The men who carried it in Korea, in cold that froze everything else, fired it until the last Chinese assault formation broke across the snow, and they did not ask for a different cartridge. They asked for more ammunition. The men who wrote the procurement specifications in Washington never grasped the difference between those two requests. One Marine who fought at Chosin and later spent 20 years as a marksmanship instructor told his students the round had never let him down in weather that had let everything else down. He did not say it with pride. He said it the way a man states a fact he is tired of having to repeat. If the history of what American soldiers actually carried, and why the men who carried it had to fight the system as hard as they fought the enemy, is the history you're here for, subscribe to Warfare Unclassified. There's more coming.